When I was in grade 4, I got in trouble with my teacher for reading Twilight in class. She told me that she didn't want to see me reading books like that, she didn't think was appropriate, and I remember thinking to myself, well, you certainly won't see me reading them then, and proceeded to do so in secret under my desk for the rest of the year. But that was when I first learned that not all books and not all characters are created equal in the eyes of society. If, as a child, I was reading classic literature, that was worthy of praise. But if I was reading Twilight, that behavior is an issue. In my presentation, I'll be discussing the influence of sexism on the critical reception of idealized characters in derivative fiction, specifically the fanfiction trope of Mary Sue and the epic hero Aeneas. So I'm going to start things off with a discussion of what derivative fiction is, and then we'll explore how a lot of the criticism that's hurled at genres of derivative fiction, like fanfiction, are the same as the abuse that's been hurled towards novels for hundreds of years. Then we'll meet the fanfiction character trope Mary Sue and discuss why she's seen as the worst of the worst. From there, we'll contrast our reception of Mary Sue with Aeneas, who is suspiciously venerated given how much he has in common with Mary Sue. And finally, I'll try to answer the question of what our reception of perfect characters says about us. So, what is derivative fiction? It's some sort of creative work based upon one or more pre-existing works of fiction. We are pretty familiar with this concept. For example, modern adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes stories have been extremely popular in the 21st century. Indeed, many of our most culturally venerated works of fiction are derivative in nature. Shakespeare frequently adapts pre-existing characters and narratives, such as Antony and Cleopatra, Troilus and Cressida, and Romeo and Juliet. Looking a bit further back in time, Dante's Inferno famously transforms characters from Greek and Roman mythology and history into this biblical crossover where Dante himself is the main character, being guided through hell by Virgil, his favorite poet. Speaking of Virgil, Virgil's epic The Aeneid lifts a minor character from the Iliad and shamelessly recycles characters and tropes and plot lines. We'll be returning to the Aeneid in greater detail later, but on the topic of Greek literature. The Greeks were all about derivative fiction. Theater in ancient Greece was full of plays that adapted characters from mythology, like Euripides' tragedies, Medea and Helen. So derivative fiction has been around for essentially as long as there's been literature, but naturally our relationship with it has changed as society has changed. That said, certain innovations have been more influential than others. For example, copyright law. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century permitted an explosive increase in the production of printed books, jumping from 10 million to over 100 million books per year in Europe. So the ownership of books and ideas became a culturally significant concern, and the British government created the Statute of Anne, the first copyright law. It granted publishers of a book legal protection for 14 years and created a public domain for literature thereafter. Since then, the copyright term has expanded from a maximum of 28 years to 42 to 56 to 75 to 95 to up to 120 in certain circumstances. And Disney has actually held an enormous amount of sway on US copyright law by lobbying for extensions whenever their copyright over Mickey Mouse is about to expire, which is ironic behavior for Disney, particularly when you consider that their bread and butter is derivative fiction. They did not invent Sleeping Beauty or Ariel or Belle. So derivative fiction is not new, but innovations like copyright law and, as we'll soon see, the advent of the internet have opened up the opportunity for new forms of derivative literature. Enter fanfiction. Fanfiction is just fiction that's written by a fan about and featuring characters from a particular TV series or movie or really any pre-existing narrative. The term came into use in the 20th century as copyright laws began to distinguish between stories that use established characters that were authorized by the copyright holder and those that were not. It was popularized and defined through the Star Trek community of fans in the 1960s. The first Star Trek fanzine, Spockanalia, contained fanfiction, and it was published while Star Trek was still in its first season. Many other fanzines sprung into existence soon after, and the genre of fanfiction flourished. But there were financial limitations regarding who could access these stories and who could publish them, because the printing and distribution of physical fanzines costs money. But with the advent of the internet, these barriers to publishing stories were dismantled. Now all you need to access or create fanfiction is access to a computer and the internet. The current monolith in fanfiction is a platform called Archive of Our Own, which is shortened to AO3 by its users. It's an open source, non-commercial, non-profit, multi-fandom web archive built by fans for hosting fanfiction. It's home to over 48,000 fandoms, has over 4 million registered users, and approaching 9 million works of fiction. For context, that's approximately the same size as English Wikipedia. AO3 is run by the Organization for Transformative Work, a non-profit fan activist organization. It exists to protect and defend the genre of fan fiction because it requires defense. It's not highly regarded and is frequently attacked by those who hold more power in the entertainment industry. Take, for example, the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon, which has been turned into a popular television series by Starz. In 2008, the author wrote a notorious and rapidly deleted blog post that expresses her objections to fan fiction, in which she likens it to selling your children into white slavery. So likening derivative fiction to slavery is obviously completely unacceptable, objectively ridiculous, and incoherent, but it demonstrates how powerfully some authors fear and distrust fan fiction. Let's take a look at The Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, which was adapted into the television series Game of Thrones. He has this quote on his official website, which you can look up, in which he describes fan fiction as a useless endeavor that he warns against. He implies that people use fan fiction as a stepping stone towards professional writing, which largely isn't true. For most writers, it's a hobby and it's a community, and it's not a job. But the most famous response to fan fiction by an author is that of Anne Rice, who wrote The Vampire Chronicles, which was adapted into the movie Interview with the Vampire with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. So she posted this on her official blog in 2001, and the statement was followed up by attacks on fanfic authors by her legal team. They emailed threats to these authors, they attacked businesses that they owned, they dug up personal information about the authors and used that as part of their harassment. And these fanfic authors couldn't legally defend themselves, so any fanfiction relating to The Vampire Chronicles or Interview with the Vampire was essentially scrubbed from the internet, and the authors went into hiding. So, as we can see, derivative fiction is extremely old and extremely popular, but our relationship with it is dynamic and has changed considerably with the advent of copyright law and the internet, allowing a new genre to come into existence, fan fiction. But fan fiction gets a lot of hate, particularly from authors and critics. So let's take a look at the history of the novel to help us understand where this hate is coming from. Because after all, our cultural discomfort with fan fiction has deeper roots than just those relating to copyright and ownership. And these concerns are expressing many of the same anxieties that those in power have been whining about regarding women's literature for thousands of years. So returning to this slide, this incredible explosion in the output of books wasn't because people were desperate for Bibles and dictionaries. Literacy was on the rise, and novels were selling like crazy, particularly within a certain subset of the population, women. More so than ancient or medieval literature, there were a lot of novels written by women for a female audience that tended to focus on the domestic sphere. Some of these novels by women that center female stories are counted among great literature. I mean, you know you've made it when there's a Penguin Library edition of your book. But the vast majority of these novels were critically skewered. They were seen as trash in much the same way that the modern-day Harlequin romance is looked upon with disdain and embarrassment. In a sermon from 1574, the clergyman Edward Hake wrote about the impact of reading novels on young women. He said that either she is altogether kept from exercises of good learning and knowledge of good letters, or else she is so nouseled in amorous books, vain stories, and fond trifling fancies, that she smelleth of naughtiness, even all her life after. Wow. Many of the critics going after women's literature were actually female authors themselves. George Eliot, which is Marianne Evans' pen name, wrote a review called Silly Novels by Lady Novelists, in which she slammed the female authors who were flooding the market with formulaic romance novels. She describes these silly novels as a genus with many species, the most popular of which being the mind and millinery genre. These typically describe an idealized young woman whose biggest problem in life is the issue of who she's going to marry. In these novels, the heroine knows every character in the book, and all these characters view her experiences as being central to their own. So she's not only the heroine of her own life, but also recognized by everyone around her as being the heroine. And George Eliot wanted to change women's fiction. She wanted to replace the sentimental, unrealistic, pretentious wish fulfillment with what she considered as being more accurate representations of women's lives. The early feminist Mary Wollstonecraft also derided the genre of women's literature in her work A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which she says that the best method, I believe, that can be adopted to correct a fondness for novels is to ridicule them. That said, her daughter went on to write an astonishingly popular and influential novel, so either she didn't take her own advice or perhaps her methodology was just fundamentally flawed. So I think George Eliot and Mary Wollstonecraft's criticism's unfair. These silly novels are fantasies, they're wish fulfillment, and they're fun. This ties in with the concept of absorbed reading versus critical reading. Absorbed reading is feeling with a story. It's getting sucked into the world, and it's generally a highly emotional experience. Critical reading, on the other hand, is a taught skill. It's about analyzing the text as an outsider rather than experiencing it as a participant. And the difference between absorbed reading and critical reading is highly gendered, where reading emotionally is seen as reading like a woman, whereas reading critically is akin to reading like a male scholar. This drove much of the critical reception of these formulaic romance novels. And the rejection of absorbed reading is not only sexist, but a reflection of class and taste hierarchies. One should read like a high-class scholar of discerning taste, not like an uneducated woman. In general, books by and about women make people nervous. As print proliferated, concerns began to be expressed about the impact of reading these books on the young and the female, and this tied in with concerns over moral control. Anything that encouraged women and young people and poor people to dream or imagine an alternative reality threatened civic order and civic virtue as imagined by the dominant political theory. Novels were and are subversive, and in a very similar way to the way in which fan fiction is subversive. In many ways, fan fiction is like the new novel, and that it's a new art form that's been co-opted by women that questions authority. So, novels are old, and they're popular, specifically among women, and for that reason, they are considered dangerous. So with that in mind, who is Mary Sue, and what's her problem? To circle back to fanfiction, it possesses what I call 7 deadly sins that make it socially unacceptable. It exists outside of the professional sphere, and that it's an amateur hobby. It's a relatively new form of media. Its main demographics are women and young people, and it's largely produced by women and young people. It's derivative in nature and therefore inferior or even illegal. It's based on works that are culturally dismissed, and it's centered on topics that are culturally dismissed. All of this makes fanfiction very cool and subversive to my mind, but sometimes, even within the fanfiction community, a person can be seen as going too far. These sins are exemplified in the character trope known as Mary Sue. So the origin of the Mary Sue trope can be traced back to the early Star Trek fandom. Within this community, a fan noticed a trend in that many fanfic stories featured this original main character who didn't belong to the canonical world of Star Trek. And this character was always unusually young, the whole crew would fall in love with her, the plot revolved around her, and she often had some sort of unique physical identifier. So this fan, Paula Smith, published a satirical fan fiction titled A Trekkie's Tale in 1973 in a highly influential print zine called Menagerie. And it was about this character named Mary Sue who possessed all these characteristics, and after that, the term caught on like wildfire. So even though it was first coined almost 50 years ago, the telling of stories with Mary Sue's has persisted, particularly among young fanfic authors who haven't been taught that this is an unacceptable trope. And as a result, the mockery of this trope persists as well. If you search Mary Sue on AO3, you'll find a lot of satire. Here's an example from last October 2020 about a character who realizes she's a Mary Sue and fully breaks down. Here's another one that describes a parody of the most enduring and aggravating self-insert tropes. If you look up Mary Sue on Wattpad, which is another fanfiction platform, the top results are all either satire of the trope or instructions on how not to write one. It's worth mentioning that the tagging systems and information architecture for platforms like AO3 are exceptional. It's very easy to find or filter out certain types of stories. The database was nominated for, and actually won, a Hugo Award in 2019, in no small part due to the platform's architecture. But you can't actually find an earnest Mary Sue fanfic under a Mary Sue tag because it's not a label a fanfic author would use to self-identify their story. Because as you can see, it has pejorative connotations, or the author is writing this trope unintentionally. So what exactly do people hate about this trope? Well, people on the internet are very quick to inform you that Mary Sue is an example of bad writing. Mary Sue characters, by definition, are characters who damage a narrative. They typically have skills or abilities without adequate justification. They seem to warp the narrative around them. And most egregiously, they drain the narrative of conflict, almost never failing at anything of consequence. So, okay, they're not for everyone. That's understandable. Nothing in media can possibly please everyone simultaneously. But there's other tropes and patterns in fanfic that can be viewed as bad writing that don't elicit the same unanimous degree of hostility. Mary Sue is the exception to an otherwise fully embraced rule in the fanfic community. DLDR, don't like, don't read. If you don't like a story, don't read it, and certainly don't bombard the author with comments describing why you hated it. But the Mary Sue trope is so hated that this baseline level of respect doesn't apply. This harkens back to Mary Wollstonecraft's advice. The best way to correct a fondness for novels is to ridicule them, and the best way to correct a fondness for Mary Sue's is to ridicule them. That said, Dante's Inferno was accepted as canonical by the Catholic Church despite possessing many of the same characteristics as your typical Mary Sue fanfic. This indicates that perhaps there's something else afoot, that the characteristics of a Mary Sue or idealized self-insert character aren't inherently bad writing or aesthetically repugnant. Perhaps it's related to who's allowed to tell these stories and who's allowed to be idealized. So, Mary Sue is an idealized original character who's been highly satirized over the past 50 years and accused of possessing characteristics like breaking reader immersion. So with that in mind, let's turn our attention to Aeneas. Who is he, and why do people love him? The Aeneid is a Latin epic poem written by Virgil over the course of 10 years between 29 and 19 BC, and it's considered to be one of the great works of Roman literature. But before Aeneas starred in his own epic, he was a minor character from the Iliad. One of the things that really stands out to me about his role in the Iliad is how often he gets saved, particularly given that his odds of survival were not great. The epic features 240 battlefield deaths, 188 of which were Trojan, like Aeneas. In the Iliad, Aeneas first gets saved in Book 5 by Aphrodite, but this makes sense. Aeneas is Aphrodite's son. The gods love to save their children. But it happens again, also in Book 5, this time with Apollo stepping in to whisk Aeneas away from harm. Lucky guy, getting saved by not one but two gods, but this still checks out. Apollo's on the side of the Trojans, he has skin in the game. But then in Book 20, Aeneas finds himself fighting Achilles one-on-one, and if you're familiar with the Iliad, you'll recall that Achilles is on a bit of a roll here. And so none other than Poseidon steps in to rescue him. Aeneas literally gets tossed to safety. And this one is the strangest of all because Poseidon is on the side of the Achaeans. He's supporting the Greeks. So why does he do this? Poseidon explains why he saves him. He describes how Aeneas is a devout and pious man who always leaves excellent offerings to the gods, but more importantly, he is destined to be the survivor of the Trojans. So it's not surprising that Virgil took one look at this character and saw an enormous opportunity to craft some powerful Roman propaganda. Virgil's version of Aeneas in the Aeneid is very much his own character, despite the fact that he was adapted from the Iliad. And we can see this in the two epithets that Virgil uses for him again and again and again, pious and pater. Aeneas is pious in his acceptance of the obligations placed upon him by fate, by the will of the gods, and by the bonds of family and community. He is the embodiment of Roman virtues. This pious nature is what inspired Poseidon to save him in the Iliad, and this characteristic is demonstrated repeatedly in the Aeneid. Aeneas brings a couple of things with him as he flees the sack of Troy. He brings his father, thrown over his shoulder, and the statues of his household gods, the Lares and the Penates. Over the course of the epic, he never loses sight of his goal. He easily fulfills the patriotic role as leader of his people. His people never question his judgment. They can consistently acquiesce to his decisions. Even in his absence, his rule is respected, and Aeneas never allows his emotions to cloud his sense of duty. Virgil does endow him with human characteristics like emotions. In Book 1, he experiences overwhelming grief when he can't find his wife Creusa in the fall of Troy, and he feels discouraged when his fleet is struck by a storm, but neither of these obstacles really end up being long-term problems for him. In Book 4, Aeneas is torn between his love for Dido and his need to fulfill his mission, as you can see in the above quote, but he doesn't let his emotions actually influence his decisions or behavior. In essence, he never messes up and he never faces any consequences for his actions because he never does anything wrong. There's vigorous scholarly debate as to whether Aeneas actually grows and changes as a character, because if he's perfection incarnate, there's no room for growth. And this renders his characterization as being very different from Achilles and Odysseus, our Homeric heroes, who quite famously make some dubious decisions. But Aeneas can't be problematic, because there's a strong flavor of propaganda in the Aeneid. The link between Aeneas and Julius Caesar and Augustus is continuously hinted at, and aims to remind readers that Virgil's patron was descended from the gods and a long line of heroic figures. Virgil even directly refers to Augustus on a few occasions, one of the most notable being the showcase of the parade of future Romans in hell. As a piece of propaganda used to support the divinely ordained nature of the Roman Empire, Aeneas is perfect. This pious, godly family man can do no wrong. Everyone in the narrative knows he's the main character. He has no discernible flaws, and can be seen to warp any narrative he's part of, like how Poseidon saves him in the Iliad. Does this sound familiar? The Aeneid continues to be viewed as high and canonized literature and of substantial cultural value. Its legacy has been carried forward over thousands of years, supported in part by the post-secondary education system. It's considered a work worthy of analysis and is treated as such. If you study classics at Oxford, you're going to study the Aeneid. If you study classics at Chicago, you're going to study the Aeneid. If you study classics at Guelph, you're going to study the Aeneid. So, there we go. Aeneas is a character of Homeric origins who is converted into this pious and perfect version in Virgil's Aeneid, and is celebrated for these characteristics. So now I think we're in a position to answer this question. What does our reception of perfect characters say about us? The issue with Mary Sue is that she breaks reader immersion and warps stories in unfamiliar ways, kind of like a black hole. Imagining a female character as flawless runs contrary to so many deeply held cultural beliefs, even on an unconscious level, I'd argue. Fanfiction is generally regarded as being a feminist space, so it's sad to see the trope of Mary Sue's being derided within this community. But it harkens back to George Eliot's criticism of silly novels by lady novelists. Both Mary Sue's and silly novels feature idealized characters who are faulted by readers and critics for their perfection and narrative warping abilities. Aeneas possesses these same narrative warping characteristics. He floats his way through his epic, he's supported by divine intervention, and he's pushed along by fate. From the beginning of the epic, you know how it'll end. You know Aeneas will succeed because fate demands it, and we're reminded of this fact again and again. And yet, this character is celebrated, and the Aeneid is lauded as fine literature. This demonstrates that it isn't the inherent characteristics of an idealized character that determine their critical response, but the way in which they reaffirm or oppose dominant social hierarchies. Both in antiquity and now, Aeneas aligns with our cultural ideas about who should be in power and who is respected as being central to the narrative of life, while Mary Sue's, like silly novels by lady novelists, or Rey from Star Wars, defy social expectations about who a hero is, and they make people uncomfortable, and they're attacked for that. There's a saying in the fanfiction community, friends don't let friends write Mary Sue's. Forget that. Let friends write Mary Sue's, because writing a Mary Sue is a radical act of rebellion against patriarchal values.